It's often said that we don't know much about Bach, but if you compare him, for instance, with the great English poet Shakespeare, we know a huge amount.
Bach is a rather strange phenomenon historically. I think it really exposes his personality in the music. He's working, for me, really against the grain and saying things that other people don't dare to say.
The Bach Cello Suites remain a mystery. The composer left no instructions on how to play them. It's not clear for which kind of cello they were written. And the manuscript copied by Bach's wife Anna Magdalena is littered with inaccuracies. Where better to start unravelling those mysteries than Oxford, home to Magdalen College and Professor Laurence Dreyfus, one of the most eminent Bach scholars of our days. And he is joined by his equally eminent colleague, Professor John Butt of Glasgow University. Furthermore, Holywell Music Room, Europe's oldest purpose-built concert room, is the setting for Dutch cello virtuoso Peter Wispelwey to challenge himself to discover still more about Bach by performing all 6 cello suites in one concert. The Oxford concert is the dress rehearsal for Wispelwey's 3rd CD recording of the suites in celebration of his 50th birthday. But for this 3rd recording, Wispelwey is going further than ever before, and Dreyfus and Butt will also help him find playable solutions to a number of performance issues. What is the ideal tempo for a sarabande? How naughtily should one play a bourrée? And even for a man who has played the suites almost 1,000 times, there are still many mysteries to solve.
I did 2 recordings before this one. There was a gap of 7 years, then the gap between number 2 and number 3, which is coming out now, will be 14 years. I find that very long. My intention still is to do 3 more at least, 6 suites, 6 recordings. I'm playing a different instrument. I mean a different Baroque cello, different Baroque bow as well. And I'm playing at a different pitch, the 392 pitch. The first 2 recordings were at a sort of standard Baroque pitch that everybody is playing, the 415 for the A. Now I'm a semitone down that creates a completely different cello universe. I mean, the sound is even more relaxed, but it's also more rustic and raw. Yeah, so it's a matter of colours and how you speak with your little Baroque bow.
Pieter, zullen we dat laatste stukje nog eens opnieuw doen? Misschien vanaf die lage cis daar. Wam, pam, pam. Ja? Dan hebben we die hele hoge passage ook nog eens, hè? Okay. Goed. Geef rood. Tot hier was mooi. Heel goed.
Playing this instrument at 392 is quite a different affair from playing a Baroque cello at 415. I've got one here, which is more or less tuned at 415, if it's still in tune, that is. And well, then you get a it's very different. And if I play that on this, third recording is also about meeting John Butt and Larry Dreyfus. They're both great performers, performers of Bach's music, and I've met them quite a few times in the last few years, and suddenly this idea came up that I wanted to get more out of them. I wanted to pick their brains and use them to get into Bach's brain even deeper. Many cellists, especially since the great guru Casals started playing them, consider these pieces as sort of the Bible for cellists. But of course, you both have the grand overview of his whole repertoire. So, what are these suites? Are they minor details in his output, or are they more than that?
I think they are significant works, absolutely, in the sense that they're perhaps the second group of 6 pieces that fit into a whole collection of string music. So we have the violin sonatas and partitas as volume 1, and then we have this conceived as the 6 suites as volume 2. So we see a project of complete ideas in the same way that the Klavierübung has 4 parts, and I think that's a very important side to the cello suites.
What is the order of these two? My guess is that Bach would have written the violin ones first, because the cello ones are more of a compositional challenge. There are fewer notes to play with. You have to have more experience at single line counterpoint in order to bring out a whole polyphonic texture. So my guess is that the experience of writing the violin ones was essential for Bach's conception of the second collection. But it might well be that it was a mixture of these. It might be that he wrote some of the violin ones and then wrote a cello one and so on. This would be perfectly similar to what happened with the Brandenburg concertos and with the well-timed clavier from the same period. Write a few of them, do something else, write a few more, do something else. Yes, the final version of any of Bach's collections is very seldom likely to correspond to the original motives for it. But by and large, I would say it seems likely that the cello suites came second.
And so they would be conceived as a cycle, as 6 suites. And maybe instantly in his head, he thought, okay, 6 pieces for cello. I start with G major. Is that how he would have thought? John?
It's difficult to tell, really. I mean, 6s appears not just in the case of the string pieces, but also keyboard works, the 6 partitas, 6 Brandenburg concertos, 6 sonatas for organ as well. And they all seem to have both a use value, but also a pedagogical value and a sort of imaginative value. In other words, each of them seems to have set a challenge both for the performer in each case, but also for Bach himself. And I think the cello suites in particular are very important, most of all because of the limitations of the instrument. Yeah. That by being forced to write fewer notes, he actually implies many, many more.
Yeah, Bach can be seen as an unconventional, eccentric composer. Not eccentric as an old man who wants to be against the world, but somebody who had very strong ideas or developed strong ideas and didn't care about whether he was breaking rules. So this was not an old-fashioned man who was producing music that was already outdated when he was composing it. This was a raging talent who couldn't just stop himself from what he was doing.
There seems to be a disconnect between his music and huge musical output in manuscripts, and mainly in manuscripts, and the details of his life, which often seem rather trivial. You know, the constant bickering with authority about his status. It seems that he got angry very easily. And there's a wonderful underlining in his Karloff Bible commentary when he says that, when the commentary says that you should be angry on behalf of your office and status, but never on behalf of your person. So it does seem that Bach had a very strong view of status and was very happy to be angry in that context if that status was violated.
I think it's the approbation of certain kinds of musicians. I think there's some very subtle hints. When you have again, a very enlightened critic, such as Scheibe, who had studied with him, who then forswears him and refers to him obliquely as someone that is in the wrong aesthetic, someone that is not modern, someone that is somehow doing things that are bombastic, schwülstig, things that are too complex, verworren. He is charged with unnaturalness. That's a very grave charge in the 18th century. I mean, you charge pederasts with unnaturalness, in the 18th century. I don't think we see how strange that was. Even the people in the Bach circle, Laurence Mitzler, who founded this wonderful Society for Musical Sciences in Leipzig, describes Bach setting an ode as a cantata as sehr unnatürlich. It's a very, very strange thing to do in print for someone that you're close to. So I think we need to read these signs and take these hints as these negative receptions as a kind of positive sign of what he thought he was doing. And then we can see that in the music when we compare it with that of his contemporaries, the successful contemporaries in particular. We do see some very strange things, that Bach is not going with the tide, and he doesn't aspire to normal kinds of success. You can play a piece of Bach and play one of the contemporaries, and someone who's just a layperson will see in 5 minutes, this is just immediately. This is a different kind of mind. There's more complexity. People may not get the negational sides of it. But then when we start investigating historically the kinds of compositional decisions he was making, we see this working very much against all of the categories of good taste, which are then laid out. The French are perhaps more, have that je ne sais quoi about good taste. The Germans, being Germans, are going to spell everything out. They want to tell you how to write genres, do not mix this mustn't go there. If you're going to write a pastoral, be sure that you don't write any nasty dissonances or nasty harmonies, because it's about sheep and pastoral shepherds and so forth. What does Bach do? He writes pastorals with lots of sin and suffering in there, and it has a wonderful kinds of resonances with religion, but I think also with personal experience. And as a player, I know this quite intimately, and I see it so much in Peter as well. There's no way that you cannot make yourself into a conduit for this music and assume a kind of personality, a kind of person speaking through this music.
One way of looking at this cycle is just seeing how Bach starts off sort of normal and then departs from normality. Again, 1, 2, 3, understandable cello music. example. But
it's a great example because we watch this motive from the beginning, which is, very diatonic, minor, very tragic, all of a sudden turning into this element of pain, and being stretched, over these three strings. I think there's that element, this trajectory of taking a simple gesture that is just part of the triad of music, couldn't be simpler. And then turning that into C sharp, B flat, it's pulling it apart in a really ungainly way. So the idea that you get up in the morning and you just say, I'm feeling bad about the death of my wife, I'm going to write a prelude. You see, it's not strong enough, I think, as a concept. Now, whether there is personal grief in this piece is so obvious that it doesn't need discussing, because how could you play this? I mean, the fact that the experience of that opening, as Peter played it as well, that then gets stretched into this searing pain. I mean, that's what diminished sevenths are about in music. They're bad intervals, and they're painful. They're more than tragic.
I wouldn't mind betting that Bach wrote the first three as a group and then probably spent a long time on the second three, on the order, how to place them, what keys they should be in, because this is exactly what we find in collections such as the third part of the Klavierübung, that he starts out with a good pattern that seems to work for the piece, and then after a while he changes his mind. And so you can almost sense him setting out with an ordered intention which oversteps itself.
Playing the prelude to number 3, and in one of the manuscripts it says presto, and I like that idea, because then even more you get this stream of consciousness going. But yeah, so I choose a few moments where I take a breath. Maybe I took too many.
Just wondering how you think about the setting off of justice. Yeah.
So. Well, this is the C major one.
Yeah.
Is that presto already, or should it be? That's a little bit fast.
I think when Felix Galimir, I studied chamber music with him, used to be in the Buddhist Quartet. He said there's always one bar in a piece of music, which tells you what the tempo needs to be for the rest of the piece.
Absolute speed is not important. It's the relationship of things. It's the feel of speed that's much more important than the absolute metronomic speed. Yeah. And I tend to follow Kienberger's advice in terms of speeds, by which you first of all look at the time signature, then you look at the genre of the piece, then you look at the fastest note, and you work out, well, what's going to work, what bar is it, what motive or bar gives you a clue. Then look for Italian. Only look at the Italian at the end, because that often modifies what your expectations would have been. So presto, in other words, means slightly faster than you would have expected, having taken all the other things into account already. Yeah.
And then number 4, with the weird key, the awkward key of E flat major. We think Eroica, or we think Zauberflöte, Mozart. We think big noise. But of course you can't produce a big noise. I mean, you can produce a nice resonant, but that's about it. I mean, it's on a modern cello you can do. that's awful on a Baroque cello. So somehow that's not right then. But still, you've got that in your head. So it should be like an organ. But then you could also just change your concept completely and think, well, why organ? Why not lute? Like Professor Dreyfus suggested. And maybe half of the concerts I played lute, and the other half I was hinting at organ. So now I'm definitely in lute land. So that means that I'm going to use my bow as if I'm plucking a string. Which makes it very, very intimate. So the bow will do just tiny movements and so it becomes sort of a meditation then. And still in this little world there are all these excursions to other worlds. I mean, like this whirlwind thing. There's this toccata element. It's all there, and then there's really some drama later on in this prelude, and then the movement ends like it started, just. And stops quite abruptly. And then number 5, he tunes down the top string. So then it gets seriously dark and black at times. I mean, the Sarabande is a graveyard, if you want. The opening with the that suite is extremely dark and powerful. And then you get this number 6 when the 4 strings is not enough anymore, and instead of dark it becomes extremely light. The top E string, and everything starts to jubilate. So this is the piccolo cello, and it has this added string. So this is still normal cello, and then you have the gift of the high E string, and of course Bach builds his whole piece around this 5th string, starting around that string. Then he goes up to, and then a few bars later he suddenly brings out this novelty. Yeah, I mean, I was lucky enough to start as a kid on gut strings, so I got my.
Is that normal in Amsterdam?
No, this my teacher was quite fanatic about it, but she was right. Dickie Boeke was my teacher for 10 years, and I lived in her house for 25 years, I think. I mean, I rented an apartment, but so many hours of talking about music and listening to music, looking at scores, and being introduced to Alfred Deller's music, Dieter Fischer-Dieskau, the whole Lied repertoire, but also Stravinsky and choreographers like Béjart and Kilian and Wagner operas, Bruckner symphonies. Yeah, a lot of early music as well, but it was quite broad, and I will always be grateful for that fantastic introduction into the world of music and art. See, somehow the pulling doesn't result in lust. I mean, in pleasure, in something like this. So somehow, maybe it's not louder, but somehow the resonance, the body of the instrument is
Strings ring much.
They ring. Yeah, the strings.
The steel string sort of stops dead when you stop pushing it. A gut string just goes on.
So that's why you add vibrato to just get a bit of glamour out of it.
Of course, there were gut strings. Pirastro, the old German firm, they were around. It was not difficult to get gut strings, but it was considered something old-fashioned. Instead, my mother very much insisted on gut strings. I think for purely musical reasons. I mean, she profoundly believed that the quality of the instrument and the quality of the music that you would perform would come across in a more convincing way.
As far as Baroque instruments and gut strings are concerned, and the early music movement is concerned, I've never been a member. I've never paid my membership or whatever. But what I did was just investing hundreds of hours on a cello which originally was well, in the first place wasn't a Baroque cello yet. I got a Baroque cello in my mid-20s or early 20s. But so I just started to emulate what I'd heard, and read a few treatises on the way, and then I thought, no, I need to do it on my own. I had to create my own style, my own feeling for the bow, my feeling for hair on gut string, on rope. That was important. Of course, I didn't become a member of a movement. I just picked the fruits. there?
I don't think we can honestly know for sure. I mean, there are some things that's very striking when you have you playing in thumb position, where we guess that they didn't do that yet, and certain kinds of things in the sixth suite even, which would make much more sense with a slightly smaller instrument held da spalla on the shoulder. We've got iconographical depictions that seem to go both ways. The question is really whether Bach cared about this particularly. The big difference was that if you have an instrument up like this, it is easier for a violinist violist to come and say, I think I could manage this, and if I can stretch this far with this instrument tied around my neck, that I can play with a certain kind of fingering.
It's quite clear that Bach, in a sort of homage to his background, from the sort of craftsman sort of milieu, knew a lot about instrument design, and he was from the opening of his career, he was introduced to, instruments in progress, organs, the Stadtpfeife, Stadtgeige culture. So I think he was always interested in instruments and experimenting with them, but I don't think he thought about them in the same way that a 19th century or 20th century composer would have thought, because they were still in progress.
That's right. They didn't have an essential identity.
Yeah. And there's a very telling document from 1730 when he appears, when he's writing to his town council, he appears to be envious of the court at Dresden, because he says at Dresden they only have to play one instrument each, so they can really perfect it. So in a certain sense he's looking towards what you might think of modern division of labour, where you just play one instrument, but his entire background is quite the opposite of that.
We've got these Stadtpfeifer that mostly play the wind instruments, and then we have these people called the Kunstgeige, the art fiddlers, who were probably not all that artistic, were municipal employees. And then we have students. We know that there were a huge number of students, I'm sure both playing and singing, for Bach in his establishment. And there, it's really hard to know, but I assume that the ones that are really talented are going to be given the more difficult parts. So when it comes to this notion of cello and cello suites, and we don't have a dedicatee, we don't have one person. Even the lute version of the fifth suite has a name on it, Monsieur Schuster, But it's an interesting question what Bach really cared about in writing these pieces, because even though it is a set aesthetically, we already have three different instrument types there. If we think about the fifth suite with the scordatura, with the change from the A string to G, and then the violoncelle à cinq cordes, with 5-string cello at the end. But I think it would have been silly for him to talk about it in some way as a da spalla instrument, essentializing that, versus playing it this way. The big problem we face is that if we look at the cello technique at the time, what's really interesting is there doesn't seem to have been thumb position in use yet. Now, it's possible Bach invented this and people were using it. We don't really know. But certain passages where we could watch Peter in last night's performance, using his thumb, frankly, on a slightly smaller instrument, that would be less wide, would probably be able to be played in one position without a thumb.
These suites are not sort of standard, normal repertoire for a Baroque composer. But Bach was far too unconventional. So it was experimental, it was a challenge to himself, it was going to be a challenge to the players and the listeners. And he was challenging dancers. He was using dancers and exploiting them and going beyond the dancers.
Have you ever tried leading people to dance?
Well, yeah, a few times, but also with contemporary choreographers like J.J. Kilian, just a giant in the field, and
Yeah, they don't want to go too fast.
You see people dancing about today, at least reconstructions of dances, they're much more energetic than you'd think.
Okay. And
We think of them as being very elegant and rather measured in a certain sense, but in fact...
I thought they were courtly,
yes,
more courtly than a
but there's a
bourrée.
huge amount of foot movement, that goes into it.
But I wonder whether those foot movements are not actually brought into what we call stylized dance pieces. That is to say, the fancy footwork and the fancy handwork. In the French choreography, we have choreography for the hands as well as the feet. So that all of that comes into this style of highly stylized dance music, which would make it not suitable for dancing because the dancers are already there. You are the dancer.
Yeah.
In this case.
Yeah, I'm now thinking of bourrées.
Bourrées, yes.
Bourrées. I always think of bourrées as being wild.
Yes.
And fast.
Are you thinking of the fourth one already?
And the third as well.
Right.
I mean... Is that an okay tempo for a bourrée, or were they much faster?
No, I think that to my mind, is pretty...
Yeah, so it would be a little bit faster than a gavotte.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
The point is that the dances are moving typically from the more serious to the light. There's a kind of culinary metaphor here, maybe coming even from the French idea of a great meal in the suite. You have this following of pieces, and as you get to the end, it's just little light ideas. Galanterien at the end is the term he used. The strange thing is that with Gigue, which could be a light piece, in his keyboard works, they turn very, very heavy and contrapuntal and fugal. And it's quite an interesting thing that he goes for heavy at the end, which is why, of course, the 19th century likes it much better. Instead of a light, frothy rondo, even though we hear in lots of Mozart, we get something, quite serious and finale-like at the end of a Bach suite. So as we go into courant, here, Bach was not very good with languages either. I mean, he misspelled the Italian word for and his entire life and with an accent. He was not very good at that. So there is a mixture of correntes and courants. And in the suite, the fifth famously has finally something resembling a French courant, which is more hemiolas, 6/4, more artifice, dotted figures, and so forth. The notion of running, of course, comes into courant. And the Italian correntes that he's actually writing here are on the surface at least, running pieces that are quite light, showy still, and more serious in terms of playing off gestures. They're longer than, of course, the little pieces. And then we get to the bourrées, minuets, and so forth, which are always in these paired groupings and allow for a kind of play of light and shadow with the contrast. If one is in major, then the second one will be in minor, and vice versa. And the kind of play and the contrast between these two are the kind of topic that they're playing with. So you can imagine that Bach is already thinking about how this kind of musical material will contrast, and the contrasts are extreme. This was not a typical thing. I mean, Peter, for example, makes a point of changing tempo rather radically. in actual dance suites of the period, if you had a series of, let's say, 2 minuets, very often we're pretty sure that from the dancers needed a lot of time to get around and have more choreography than the music just changed. They probably just did them attacca without stopping, and certainly at the same tempo. So that is a very interesting example where historically, one should be reprove Peter. They do not change tempo between these two, but what he's pointing toward is this extreme that they turn into character pieces, pièces de caractère. So the Sarabandes have to be certainly the most extraordinary movement amidst the center of the suites. And typically these were dances that were very aristocratic, and where dances were quite formal in order for the aristocracy to show how light they were. So, for example, people might always go on the downbeat up in French Baroque dance. So they move up like this. You see dancers is always going up. It's very, very different from sort of a 19th century waltz, where people are going down into the ground, which is much more bourgeois, grounded phenomenon. And with the Sarabandes, there was also this sense that they had to be somehow weightless, even though there were these heavy beats and they would have to come down for gravity reasons. At the end of the 4-bar phrase, there would be this ton de courant, which you'd have to sort of come down, you'd go up again. And the idea was very much that you would be traveling around the room with partners and in these wonderful configurations, tied by a string to the ceiling. So you're always amidst this, you're being controlled at the same time that you're being very expressive with hands and feet and eyes and gesture. And what I believe is that these gestures sort of come into Bach's music, that all this stylized stuff that is happening in the great dancing must have been part of his conception, but also he seems to personalize them and sing much more in them. And there's a kind of sense, particularly in the minor suites, of great tragedy in these Sarabandes, a sort of unbelievable sadness that is coming there, but all very formed at the same time and slightly held back.
I find quite often on listening to these pieces that during the course of the piece, I feel I'm not quite sure what sort of movement this is. Is it a dance? Is it a gavotte? Is it a allemande? Or so on. And one can almost get frustrated in the course of listening and feel Bach is really keeping us away from the true piece here. When's he going to reveal it? And you get to the end of the piece and suddenly you think, well, actually, now I come to think of it, my memory puts everything together. And in fact, it was a gavotte. It was an allemande. And I think this is one of the qualities of Bach that is shared by very few composers, certainly not of his own age and very few after. So somehow he conjures up the experience of hearing a gavotte without actually presenting you with the full score, the full notes of one.
it's often said about playing the cello suites, it's all about rhetoric. But of course, rhetoric is technique of bringing things to the surface. It's dance and singing. It couldn't be more true for suites, where we have formal dance forms. Using these tools almost forces you to speak. You can sing, and you will sing, but it's all done with this little brush, and that makes it a delightful language. It was a project that I've been looking forward to for a very, very long time, and it has, for me personally, has been extremely rewarding. One of the discoveries, has to be the pitch, the 392 pitch. I mean, the new sonorities that it brings, and even more remote from the modern cello sound, and it has opened doors for me, and I'll in the next 10 years, every time I perform the Bach suites, I will be carrying this with me.
I have no idea whether he will stop here. Add another 15 years, he'll be 65, and so he could do his pension version of the Bach suites. I have no idea. It depends. It can also happen that you suddenly lose interest. It's like an old love that suddenly you're not in love with anymore, and you say, I give up, or I direct my mind into a completely different direction.